Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Psychology Podcast. I am your host, Daniel Karim. In my podcast, I interview extraordinary people and pick their brains. Each episode will feature a guest who will stimulate your mind and give you a different perspective on the many paths that can lead to a rich and fulfilled life. This includes their favorite books, morning routines, exercise habits, trade secrets, nutritional philosophies, and their overall take on happiness and success. My goal is to find out where those amazing people get their holistic results from, so that you and I can use their tactics and go kick ass in life as well. Thank you for tuning in and enjoy today's episode.
So let's go. If people ask you what you do, what do you say to them? Because you do so many things at the moment.
I generally tell them I'm a writer. I think fundamentally, I'm an author, I'm a writer. Sometimes I'll say a creative exec and they say, what do you mean by creative? And I'll say I'm a writer. But it almost always comes back to the written word for me. That's kind of what I think. Simplifying things, big problems is kind of my favorite thing to do. It's my form of puzzle solving. And I think that's where it shows up best, is on the written page.
I heard in one of your former interviews that you wrote your first book when you were 12.
I tried. I tried to rip off The Hobbit, I believe, by J.R.R. Tolkien. I got a typewriter, put it on a folding table in my room, and was trying to write like a fantasy novel, basically, when I was a kid, because that was what I read when I was little, right? And my first book loves were reading The Lord of the Rings and stuff like that.
Most of what you write right now is business oriented, a little bit psychology. When did that start for you? Because like I write about psychology also, and I would have never guessed that I would write about something that is non-fantasy. But like it comes, like writing for me came after mastering to a degree my expertise of behavior psychology, but you started way earlier. So when was that transition for you happening?
I worked as an editor at HarperCollins Publishers for several years. And so I'd always worked in fiction. That had been my passion. And it was something that I dreamed of doing. I wasn't sure I'd be able to do. My first job in publishing, because every job I had, it seemed like led back to books one way or the other. And I got a job in publishing, and that was around nonfiction, how-to, and just general nonfiction books. And I discovered that in working on those books, because sometimes editing a book, you're kind of rewriting it, that the same itch that I got, scratched when I was writing creatively, pure fiction, I found it just as rewarding to do nonfiction. I still wasn't committed to doing that for a living until I'd helped a couple of writers publish on their own. And then I started working with Gary, and his goal was to write business literature, basically. And there's a lot of mindset in it. I'm flattered that you would call it psychology. We think of it more as mindset. And I like to get my ideas from proven, psychologists. Like, so I read, Dweck and your mentor, Fogg. I like to look to people that we feel like are pretty set. A lot of the behavioral psychology, as you probably are aware, some of these are not being replicated. So we have to be really careful who we look to.
You, in one of your other interviews, I heard you talk about a mind shift that you had after reading Rich Dad, Poor Dad. And I wanted to ask you a question regarding the editing process, because right now I'm in the process of writing my first book. It's about behavior psychology. It's called The Behavior Architect. And I have no one who guides me through that process. So I try a lot of stuff, and I am very delighted by the entire thing, but it's very hard, I think. And did something similar happen to you from the change of mindset, that you understood at a certain point how to write a successful book that sells and that people actually are buying, in regards to being a self-publishing author who just creates something because it has to exist for him?
Well, the mindset shift I got after reading the Kiyosaki book was just fundamentally kind of viewing my finances differently. So if I had a mindset shift around writing, it came when I was writing my first book with Gary Keller. It was about a 400-page book in a little bit more than 90 days. And so we would get together. They had flip charts with outlines. It was Dave Jinks and Gary Keller. They were just brilliant with the real estate field. And I was kind of acting as their writer. I would essentially have them teach me / interview them for 2 or 3 hours every morning. And then I would have to churn out an average of 14 pages a day. And I remember that because everything was so urgent and we were working on such a strict timeline, and it was all very exciting to me, I looked up and I realized that it's an old saying. I want to say, I don't know if it's Aristotle, but through discipline is freedom, basically. But I remember writing it up and putting it like on my wall, discipline is freedom. Because what I found is that if I immediately went and did my writing for the day and just didn't interrupt myself, I remember that room I was in was very warm. A lot of sunlight hit that side of the building. It was Austin, Texas, which is very hot. So I would want to leave the room. I would want to break my rhythm. But if I stuck with it, I would get my writing done early in the day. And then I would have several hours at the end of the day that I just felt free. And it was the first time in my life that I realized that just doing things in the right order matters a lot. And if you knock out your number one priority early, it's tremendously liberating. So that was my mindset shift. But I would just tell you, in terms of being a published author and study successful people, when you read their books, ask the question, what are they doing? How are they achieving this? And in your field, like probably the best-selling author of a psychology works are going to be Dr. Carol Dweck with Mindset. That book sold a lot of copies. And I'm going to say Angela Duckworth with Grit. I would go study those and let them be your master class. So what are they doing that makes their work so accessible? And I'm going to probably tell you that they tell simple stories that people can repeat. Because I told that story from Duckworth, the Citadel study, right? Again and again and again. And there's a story very early in Dr. Dweck's book about mindset where she talks about the kids wanting to take the worst problems home. And I just remember, blew my mind. So they both are amazing researchers that also happen to be great storytellers. Oh, and Brene Brown, my goodness. And they all have Dweck least so, Duckworth second, and Brene first and foremost. She's inspirational storyteller. And so she brings a lot of emotion to it. So study what they do. That's me. I've been in the book business for 20 years. So now, and I'm sure like, I don't know how many psychology classes you got to where you are today, but I'm sure if you sat through a lecture, you're mentally dissecting it, kind of knowing what the teacher's doing, because there's a format to your craft. There's also a format to it's not perfect and formulaic, but there is kind of a format to how books take off. And I do believe a lot of it is you make people feel smarter and you give them stories that they can repeat. That's something I learned very early on with Body for Life by Bill Phillips, a book I got the privilege to work on. There was a band that went around the outside of that book, and he wanted it to have before and after photographs of people's physical transformations, right? And today I look back and I was like, man, they photoshopped those. But I mean, they were real physical transformations, but they gave them tans when they didn't have tans and things like that. But it was double-sided 4-color. And in the book business, 4-color is tough. Double-sided 4-color is tougher. And to wrap it around the outside of a book, meaning every time a bookseller took a book out of a box, they could tear it and rip it and want to send it back. We fought tooth and nail having to do that, but he had the leverage to get it done. And what we found out later, because that book went on to sell millions of copies, people, one, they didn't know about Photoshop back then. And two, they used that as a bookmark. And that was the inspiration that got them to talk about that book. And so they would say, because his genius was that people hadn't popularized the before and after photo. And people were like, can you believe this? This person lost 110 pounds, whatever. And so they were talking about it. And I remember thinking, if as an author, you can give something, a story, a simple story that someone can repeat at a dinner party or a cocktail party, and it makes them look smarter, you're winning. Because now they're talking about your book, they're doing your advertising for you. So that's not all of it, but I think that's a big part of it. Be accessible, be a great storyteller, and I would tell you, make your book really easy to read. The best books, right, you just keep reading. They're not hard to read. So you're a psychologist first. Get your book together. If you need to, you can go hire an editor. You can go hire a ghostwriter. There's no shame in that. A lot of people do it. But that would be, I think, if I had to really simplify some advice I would give you if you aspire to reach a really wide audience. Study the best of the best. Imitate what they do your way.
That was so great advice. I only learned this recently about the power of stories. I interviewed Jeffrey Kotler very recently. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. He's one of the best therapists in the world. He wrote about more than 100 books on the field of therapy. And he introduced himself not as a psychologist, but as a storyteller first. And I found this so profoundly because when you master a field like you have mastered real estate and writing, teaching is a completely different process. I found that is you are back to ground zero, to so to say. Great book, by the way, is James McPhee's The Fourth Draft. When you want to learn a bit about writing,
I have that book, and I have it in audiobook format too. I like to read these books as a way to touch on my craft as well. But you talk about. I read a study in Jeffrey Colvin's book. It's called The Upside of the Downturn, and it's really about financial downturns. But there was early in the book, there's a study of firefighters, and they showed veteran firefighters photographs of a burning building and new firefighters, and then asked them to say what they saw. And what they found was that new firefighters could say, oh, the fire looks to be at this intensity level, and the color of the flames leads me to believe that there might be chemicals involved. It was very factual. They knew their facts. And veteran firefighters always wove it into a story. And they said, I'm guessing that this started by a spark in the ductwork and in these older buildings, and they would just wove the story. And the takeaway, and this is something you probably know, is that before we had written books, how did we communicate? We told stories, and they were fables. So we're hardwired to learn from stories. And so I do believe that people can intellectually take information in. If you provide context, which is what story does, they know how to act on it. And as an author and as a psychologist, what do we want? We want people to take action to make themselves better. So story is so fundamentally important. You just can't escape it. It might even be the one thing.
I got your book here, The One Thing, and I
got the European paperback version.
It is probably from Amazon, and I'm eagerly to see my own book like this. And I heard you interviewed a bunch of people in order to write that book, and
we worked for almost 4.5 years researching it. We had at different times 2 full-time researchers helping us. It was our first non-real estate book, so we really wanted to make sure that we were speaking the truth, not our opinion.
How did you have the patience? Because one of the things that really stresses me is when you're on a book project by yourself, is that the people outside of your life, they are expecting something, and that you somewhat survive the phase between I'm going to do this and I'm going to do this right, and finding a balance between when you have multiple projects. But for me, I cannot write any other way than to just focus on the one thing, my book. And do you handle other business projects at the same time, or do you go tunnel vision when you work on a project like a book?
I the biggest kind of misconception about the one thing is that we only get one thing. And it's really more about we can only focus on one thing at a time. And when we understand our number one priority, we give it more of our time than anything else. So I don't want to pretend like when we were writing that book, we had nothing else going on, because I had small kids, I had a marriage, we had other projects to work on. We actually paused in the middle of it to write another book. So yeah, but that was also because the Great Recession happened and our priorities changed as a result. So yes, we did not have we had our blinders on when we were in our writing sessions. so that we could have big blocks of time that were uninterrupted to focus on our work. And yes, I'm impatient. I'm also got kind of the entrepreneurial gene. 4.5 years is a very long time, all of those things. But if your goal is to write something that's truly impactful, I mean, I would challenge you to name any products that were truly life-changing or world-changing that were created in days or months. Most of them, when you look at the actual story, there were years of development that went into making things that actually changed the world. So we set a goal, and anytime we work with a publisher, I just tell them, you would be wise not to promote this book until you have the manuscript, because we will break every deadline if it means we get to write a better book.
That's awesome. That's awesome. A bit about psychology. You interviewed a bunch of people for this book, and I heard that hundreds of millionaires. Is that correct? I heard that.
For the Millionaire Real Estate Investor, which is a different book, I got the opportunity. Me and my partner Heather Iaruso was my researcher writer on my team at that period in history. We interviewed 120 millionaires, and they had to have a equity in their real estate investments of over $1 million. And typically that means excluding your primary home as well. So that was our vetting process. And I got to interview, and I still have the binders I could show you, but I've got three 3-inch binders where I printed those out. We had them transcribed, and we would just highlight all of the commonalities. And that was a real wonderful process for me, because I learned a lot of new things about money that I didn't know. And the wealthy do see the world a little bit differently than the rest of us.
Holy shit, like this is deep psychological work, because like when you look at how clinical psychology operates, for example, is you interview thousands of people, and then you look for commonalities among them and see, okay, in order to diagnose you with depression, you have to have this, and that. So I'm fascinated that you did this sort of the other spectrum of the scale. What was something that surprised you in the process of interviewing those people?
One, thank you for the compliment. And I'll say that we've gotten better. Like our first book, we interviewed 27 people. Our second book, we interviewed 120. So each time we tried to raise the bar. And with the one thing, one of our researchers pointed out, if you just look for what is in common in the top quartile, you then have to do another step, which is to take the bottom quartile and eliminate anything that the top quartile has in common with them, if that makes sense, right?
It does.
Because those could be false correlations. Yes, they all have it in common, but the worst performers also have that. So that therefore means it's not important. So we're just trying to be a little systematic in our search for the truth. I don't have as much respect for opinion books. Because it's hard to duplicate what one person has personally accomplished. They may have some special ability. So I tend to look for patterns. That's the way Gary works. We're both kind of pragmatic. So it just lined up with our experience. If you want to repeat success, look for the common threads in successful people. And those tend to be things that a lot more than successful people can do, right? They tend to be things that almost anyone can do if they choose to. So now, having just said all of that you didn't ask me about, sorry, what was something that surprised me? One of my favorite things that was kind of self-evident after the fact, one of our investors said, money lies on the other side of fear. We, I think, interpret it to be opportunity lies on the other side of fear. And I think at that point in my life, I was surprised at how many times that was true for me, that I'd stayed on the wrong side of action because I was afraid of taking an unconventional path. And so a lot of times, we often use the form of a pyramid in our books to describe that at the top, right? If you thought about the pyramid being how wide your path was, the base where everybody is very wide, because average means you can kind of do it just about any way you want. But if you want to be in the top 1% at the top of the pyramid, it's now very narrow. There are fewer things that you can do to reach that level of success. So almost by default, if you're looking for disproportionate success in any given area, you're going to have to act outside of the norms. And that creates a lot of fear for people. Oh, I'm investing in residential real estate. Most people have a 401k. This is scary. That scariness is not based on any rational thought. It's just based on doing something that's the pack is not doing. So maybe you could tell me the psychology of that. But I just started looking around and seeing it everywhere. That so much of our fear around doing the right thing is our fear of doing the unconventional thing. Does that ring true to you?
A lot. This is one of the biggest truth and biggest dilemmas there is in psychology, because like we are hardwired to avoid everything that causes discomfort, because like our brain is extremely old, and our emotional center of our brain, you probably know this, is it's like thousands of years old, and it just wasn't made for the task that we are confronted with nowadays. So yes, it makes sense to run away from a giant tiger, but it doesn't make sense to not take that job opportunity or talk to your dream girl on the streets. And people, especially pathological people who have depression, this mechanism takes over, and there's something called freezing, for example, with people who have depression who just don't get out of bed anymore because they develop an entire persona around. So it's a huge problem. So I can relate to that.
You know, I think this is going to be weird, and you may have to cut this because it's unusual and it may not be replicatable. But we have a system in our company, Keller Williams. We have a profit sharing system. And if you recruit someone to our company that generates profit, the company rewards you by giving you a share of the profit. It's not a Ponzi scheme. I mean, we are one of the most regulated industries in the world. And I worked at Keller Williams for 4.5 years before I ever even talked to someone about joining the company, because I just didn't think it was for me. And I remember a waiter heard me talking about real estate. I said, yeah, I work at Keller Williams. I work with this guy, Gary Keller. And he's like, wow, I'd love to talk to you more about that. So I paid $47 to take this guy to lunch. He joined the company. He sold one house, then quit to be a drummer in a band. But because he sold a house in an office that was profitable, yada, 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 I got a check for $87. And I remember going, whoa. I mean, you net it out. I did all this work for $40 basically, but it made it real. So sometimes the first dollar you get from an opportunity area that you might have thought wasn't available to you can be incredibly impactful. But I remember going home and telling my wife, dollar for dollar, this might be one of the bigger opportunities we've ever had. And we need to be a little bit more purposeful. And so my sister joined a real estate team. My wife eventually became a real estate agent. I recruited my family, right? And you look up and we get about $40,000 a year in passive income from that program today. And that's substantial, right? And we look at the rate at which it's grown. It's been growing at an average pace of like 20% year over year. And you look up, and Wendy did the math with her coach, and we looked out and she goes, of all of our financial opportunities, we own real estate, we own businesses, this one has shown the healthiest growth pace of any of them. And we might look up in 20 years and it might be the single most important source of our wealth. And it all started because of a drummer that sold one house and a check for $87. And I've heard similar stories from people who deposited their first rent check, right? When they became a landlord, or when they were, house hacking and just took in roommates that paid them. Sometimes that money, those moments really stand out. I'm actually thinking of another one. I got a kid to mow yards for me when I was a kid, probably 12 years old. I was mowing yards for money. I got $20. I went on vacation. He asked if he could mow my yards, and I offered to pay him $10. I said, I'll give you $30 to mow all three. And I went home and I had to ask my dad, I said, was that wrong? And my dad said, no, it's not wrong. You're the one who hustled and got the work. He didn't make any money. If he said yes to $30, pay him $30. And he goes, and now what did I get? It took me many years, but I was like, I think back at that often. That was my first business income ever. I didn't have to work. Someone else did the work and I got the money. I was like, whoa. I mean, and back then that was a lot of comic books. So anyway, I think the first dollar from an opportunity that was unexpected is sometimes the most important because it shows us that there's this potential out there that we can tap. That's my theory.
That was awesome. Never hold back when I ask you something, because this is where the good stuff comes from. Stories. That's what people can relate to. Advice for people who are at the very, very beginning of their journey. And I'm sure you get this question a lot, but
wealth building, productivity journey. Give me, authorship. We've talked about a lot of things.
Wealth building. There's a kid who has like, I don't know, $100 in his pocket, has a normal job and dreams of being rich. What would you tell this guy?
If you Google it on YouTube, I gave an investing talk at the Google Author Talks. And it's about 45 minutes, and I kind of wove in the themes of the one thing with wealth building. But I almost always come back, and I learned this from Gary when we interviewed the 120 millionaires, that if there was one habit to build, it's track your net worth. And so the first time my wife and I did it, it was after a class with our vice chairman at the time, our CEO at the time, Mo Anderson, sent me home with basically a blank mortgage loan application and challenged me and my wife to figure out our net worth. And we did it. And I think our net worth was like $2,200. And most of that was in the form of a Toyota Tercel that would be dead in about a year. We had a little bit of 401k, and luckily we didn't have a lot of debt, but that was the first time we ever measured net worth. And net worth, if someone's listening and has no idea, that means you add up all your assets, what you own, you subtract all your liabilities, the debt that you owe, and the remainder, positive or negative, is your net worth. Not self-worth, but net worth. And on the wealth building journey, tracking that number, which my wife, I do it every week now. For many years, we did it every month. That made us so cognizant of the assets that tend to appreciate, of assets that throw off cash flow. When we bought things that depreciated, we now were aware that, when you buy a car, even a used car, every day you own it, your net worth goes down because that is an asset that depreciates, unless you buy like a classic car maybe and don't drive it. But a home, you buy a home, and every month, even if it doesn't appreciate in value, if you're making mortgage payments, you're paying down the debt and your net worth grows up. And you start to put two and two together and internalizing the difference between assets and liabilities and appreciation and cash flow, you just start making lots and lots of better decisions. So I think that is the singular habit that helps build financial wealth and financial health. If someone is deeply in debt, in that kind of cycle of debt, I say go read Dave Ramsey and then go to net worth, because you need to figure out how to get out of that cycle first. But that to me is the big one. Start tracking your net worth if you're on this journey. It will make a huge difference.
I watched that Google talk from you yesterday, and it was, I made my girlfriend watch it too. It's 1 hour. It's really, really good stuff.
There's an Uber driver that watched that, and he reached out to me. He lives in Ireland. I don't want to share who he is or anything else about him, but he was transparent, and he showed me on the wall where he started graphing his net worth in a green pen on paper, right? He wasn't even using a spreadsheet, but he went from a negative amount, I want to say $2,000 or $3,000 in 2 years to positive $44,000, all driving a cab. And so much of that happens not because he was buying assets, but because he started minding his money very, very differently. And he still reaches out to me very regularly on Facebook Messenger to let me know how he's doing. And it's just really cool. It works.
That's amazing. And there's actually a lot of psychological wisdom in what he did. There have been, do you know Dan Ali? Is one of my favorite psychology professors from Duke, great guy. And he did some studies in Africa where they give little coins to people in order to save more money. And if they still had the coin at the end of the month, they would get two. And the theory behind that was that our surrounding is completely designed towards spending and buying stuff. And we never remind ourselves that saving is actually a good idea. So by redesigning his environment, he was aware of it. So it's one of the first things that people should do, I think, is to make it visible, because you don't see it if you spend more than you make. And
so Dan Early at Duke, I will look that up. Thank you. That's a good tip.
he's great. You will love him. One more thing. I hope that I one day write a bestseller myself. What happens if you write something of those pieces? How has your life changed after writing this baby?
I'll say this, just to set expectations, that most authors, very rarely is this the exception, don't make most of their wealth from selling books. That business, it's very tough. You need to be selling hundreds of thousands of books to kind of be a full-time author, or writing a book all the time, right? You're just constantly churning out the books. So that's a big deal. The first thing that it'll do for you, just writing a book, even without a bestseller, is that from a reputation, you can say, I wrote the book about X. So people who write books for their profession can charge higher speaker fees. They get invited to bigger stages. It's a platform. It gives you more visibility and more authority to do what you want to do. If you're lucky enough to become a best-selling author, it also tends to open up doors for you. I've found that because I've got that now in my bio, I can reach out to people that normally wouldn't respond to strangers and just say, I would love to chat with you and learn from you. And it's easier for me to get a lunch with them. So, and I try to take advantage of that, right? I want to meet with people that I can learn from and try to build habits around that. So first and foremost, from a positioning standpoint, it's great for your professional career. You can theoretically charge more money or get on bigger platforms and see bigger audiences. And eventually it becomes a door opener. And if you're really, really successful, it's passive income, royalties. I don't have to sell every book. Amazon and Barnes & Noble and airport bookstores do it for me. And so it becomes another source of passive income, which is wonderful for wealth building.
Yeah. Also, it's a huge time investment. I don't think.
As you've learned, it takes a lot. That's the barrier to entry, right? A lot of people won't do that.
Yeah, I agree. I heard a beautiful story you told about quitting your job and going backpacking with your wife for 5 months. And I wanted to ask you, for many of my listeners, they still have day jobs, and I'm lucky that for 2 years now I can just work full time on my passion. How did it feel for you, just quitting your job and having a partner on your side who's on board with your mission? Because very few people are privileged enough to have like this system at home where, hey, we do this together.
One, the best decision I ever made was asking my wife to marry me, right? And then following through on it. That was huge for me. Just to make sure that we don't oversell this. It's not like I quit my job and then just went to write full time. My wife and I, we were working in New York. New York is very tough if you don't make a fair amount of money. And in publishing, you just don't. It's a high prestige, low pay job. We both did not want to start a family in New York. And I'd been there for almost 7 years. We just felt like we wanted to change. So we knew that a transition moment would be an opportunity for us to travel. And we both love to travel. So we really did this more about our love of travel and knowing that this was one of those rare moments in our adult life where we could create a big window. So we quit our jobs. We gave up our apartments. We moved everything into storage. And I remember the bill was like $200 a month, right? So we prepaid for 6 months of that. And we went traveling, and I'd lived in Europe before, so I had friends that I could stay with. We had very few hotel bills. Our first night of our honeymoon, we slept on a park bench. So we were on a budget. We slept on trains. We stayed on friends' couches, and it was really about the journey. So it was a huge gift. We got to spend 5.5 months, I think, together traveling. And I joked back then, I was like, either we'll find out really quickly, right, if we're meant to be married, or we'll be divorced before we come home. Because traveling is also stressful. But it was great. It worked out. And she and I have been great partners. She's also a fabulous entrepreneur. And so she loves real estate. She runs our real estate team. It's a huge business. And So we get home, we walk the dog, and we talk about our days and our poor kids. We were on a road trip once, and my son, we were playing Would You Rather, which is, if you've ever played that, my son said, and he was probably 7 at the time, would you rather be trapped in an elevator with dad talking about his books or mom talking to her clients? And we all just cracked up because there's no winning that one, right? Because we both are insufferable. We love what we do. And we talk about it all the time, right? And hopefully, if nothing else, we're role modeling to our children that a job doesn't have to be a place that you suffer through your work, that you can be passionate about your job and love going to work. And that's definitely the case for both me and my wife.
That was beautiful. I'm also dating a girl. I think she's also the one. And we have our big challenge in front of us. We are going next month to Indonesia. And we are both a bit scared that we spend 24/7 on each other. And we hope that we come back in one piece.
You know what? The gift you'll get either way is to find out. And that's a gift either way, right?
It is. Man. Let's move on to the last section of the interview. What would constitute a perfect day for you?
My favorite days are days where I get to do creative work. I have space to think. I get a little alone time and a lot of family time. So it changes, right? But I have a good day when I feel like I've made a contribution. I know I've written something good that's going to help someone, that I've got an idea that will drive one of those things. It's a pretty low bar, I love it when we've designed our life where my wife, we eat breakfast together with our kids. We have dinner together with our kids. We work out together in the morning, my wife and I. Sometimes my son now, who's 15, will join us. And so we get a lot of the things that are most important to us, just kind of guaranteed. And we've designed our life around that. But when I can go to work and make a difference, I love it. That's even better.
It's beautiful. Regarding making a difference, and what's the guiding force of your life? If that's too tough, I definitely professionally am here to help other people. Gary and I, when we started our book company, we wanted to write books that identify the models of big success and that were both instructive and inspirational. And we just feel like if you don't inspire people, they won't take action. But if you don't step out on a limb and say, and this is how you do it, instruct people, they'll get all excited and not know what to do. So we were very clear around that. My personal mission, it's kind of corny, but I'm here, like I know what motivates me to do my best work is that I'm trying to be the best husband and father I can be. And I don't want to tell my kids to work hard and be out of integrity with that. I think that my wife, we've been married now, it'll be 20 years this summer. She deserves to have me earning her respect every single day, not taking it for granted. So when I think about the world through those lenses, I don't mail it in. I give my best. And that's all you can do. But I want to find that thing that motivates me to give my best effort, to leave it all out there. And that tends to be it for me. What I want to get from those things, right, may be different, but I know what motivates me is my role of husband and father are very, very motivational to me. It's beautiful that you got your priorities right. So many male people are so driven by achievement by alone that they kind of forget that balance. Let's have 2 more questions and then we are good to go. And then I stole enough of your time, more than I can take.
I'll say this about, you just said something kind of profound. There are a lot of people who are driven by achievement. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. They need to know why. Why is it important that they're achieving? And if they can identify the healthy reasons behind it, not to prove some teacher wrong that doubted them when they were in high school, right? They can, at some point, they can take that chip off their shoulder. But when they do, they have to replace it with a positive reason. So achievement is doing something really positive for them, or this, they wouldn't keep doing it. So they need to identify what their big why is and embrace it. And that would be my advice. It's like, otherwise you never get off out of the rat race. You're on that wheel all day long and you never know where the finish line is. But understanding why we're driven is very liberating, and not judging it, just acknowledging it. and working with it. That's a very powerful thing for people to do. And most of us are just moving too fast to think about it. And if we didn't know, the people who love us could tell us if we were brave enough to ask. So anyway, I just think that's important. So I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Keep going, Daniel.
And this is I want to hear what's going on in what's your brain. I already know what I think. No, this is what you said was very profound. Sigmund Freud one time said that in order for a man to grow up, he has to kill his father, and he meant that metaphorically, is that so many people do things in order to be liked by others and really live their life for somebody else, and forgot that, hey, if you heal those wounds from your childhood, that there's an entirely new universe from stuff that you didn't know that exists.
Gary often asks young people kind of rhetorical question. He'll say, whose life are you leading? And then he'll say, and then can you prove it? And a lot of people are living the lives that their parents expected them to live, or that their spouse expects them to live. And if you ask them for proof, they're not leading their own life. And we wrote about this in The One Thing. At the end of most people's lives, they can't deny that. And their number one regret is that they didn't live the life that they could have lived. Keith Cunningham, who's a Austin teacher and someone I think of as a very profound guy, he said, hell is meeting the person you could have been. And I think that's true. I think, whose life are we leading? It serves us all well to figure that out and make sure we're leading our lives. Otherwise, there will be regrets. And again, I keep interrupting you, but we're in this kind of like super deep stuff where you don't go very often. I love these conversations.
I love it too. And for me, it's this, I'm grateful, but I know that you have a lot on your plate, and that you have a lot of dreams that you want to accomplish. That you took an hour out of your schedule to talk to me really means a lot, and I won't forget this so easily. But we are at the end of our interview. I know you have stuff to do. I'm an aspiring entrepreneur and writer. What questions should I have asked you?
If you don't have it, sounds like you might. I think that, are you building habits and how to build them? So I think that most of what we do, I want to say, I interviewed, I'm looking at my bookshelf, if the one I'm looking off camera. She wrote The Happiness Project, and I'm going blank on her name. I interviewed her around her book called Better Than Before. And in her research, she found that I think 77% of our days is driven purely by habit. If so much of our life is on autopilot, it serves us really well to align our habits with our dreams. So my main thing is, are you exploring that? Do you know how that works? I know you've worked with BJ Fogg, so you can do a whole podcast just on habit formation right there. But that is, to me, the superpower. When people build habits that help them achieve the things that matter most, boy, that's really powerful. And if you don't know how to do it, stop and ask.
That's beautiful. I don't have any more questions to ask you. I'm very grateful that you took time out of your schedule. I hope that we stay in touch. And this is it for me, man. I wish you a beautiful day, and I'm so happy to watch this again and write a couple of words about it.
No problem. And you have a great trip with your girlfriend in Indonesia. I'll be thinking positive thoughts for you.
Oh, please, man. I need that. I hope I don't mess this up.
All right. Take care. It was great meeting you.
Well, folks, this was today's episode. I hope this could add some value to you guys. This podcast still is in its experimental phase, so please let me know what you liked and didn't like. You can let me know on my blog, danielkarim.com, or on social media. As always, thank you so much for listening, and tune in next time.